Okay, welcome everyone. Thanks for sticking around for the very last symposium of the conference. My name is Stefan L, and over there is Xavier Hinaut. Together we organized this symposium, Bilingual Sentence Processing when Models Meet Experiments. And this started when we realized we were both interested in working on bilingual sentence processing models. And we realized that there's a lot of work in experiments in bilingual sentence processing. There's a lot of computational psycholinguistics going on in the single language case. And in the field of computational linguistics and natural language processing, there are more and more of these massively multilingual models that are super impressive, but never make any contact to human bilingualism. So I thought it would be great to get some people together who are interested in the intersection between experiments and models. So people studying bilingualism from the perspective of computational models, but with an interest in experiments, and people doing experiments with an interest in computational models, or even people doing both. We'll have 4 talks. We aim for 15 minutes per talk, and after each talk, if you have urgent clarification questions, please ask them, but try to keep your discussion questions until the end, because then we'll have a panel discussion, and you can ask any question you want or start a discussion, and of course the speakers can also ask each other questions or discuss with each other. Okay, so our very first speaker is Edith Kaan. She is one of the best known researchers in the field of bilingualism worldwide. She was just made a full professor at the University of Florida. And she started her linguistics career not as somebody working on bilingualism, but actually as a generativist, a bit of a Chomskyan, if I may say so, even. That was in Groningen, where she did her PhD. She also spent a few years at Duke University, but now she's been in Florida for a while. And it's also important to mention tomorrow is her birthday. I don't know if she's planning any big party, but if you stay another night, who knows? So the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you, Stefan, and thank you, Xavier, for organizing this. I should start by saying I'm not a modeler at all. I am an experimentalist, and for the past 30-some years or so, I have been looking at human sentence processing. So that's what, briefly speaking, covers now the processes from word recognition, if you believe in that, word recognition to the formation of a higher level understanding of the sentence, or the other way around if you look at production. And after 30 years, what became clear to me is that it's really complicated. So to give you a nice illustration of how something seemingly simple is complicated. Let me give you an example from a field that I'm really interested in at the moment, and that's predictive sentence processing. So if you speak a gendered language, such as, for instance, Norwegian, you can use gender marking as a predictive cue of what comes next in the sentence. So if you have native speakers of Norwegian, listen to sentences in which they use the indefinite determiner are gender marked, so that's en or et in the example. And they look at a display with an object whose label is masculine versus an object whose label is neuter. They start to move their eyes towards the target object, so say that was the masculine glove, on the basis of that gender determiner. So you see that in the graph. Let's see, no, you cannot see my mouse, but in the graph, you see that blue line, that's the target, fixations to the target, and you see that that diverges from the control condition way before the noun onsets in the speech input. So that's evidence for predictive processing. Oh, that's simple, right? No, not really, because there are tons of factors that affect predictive processing, not only of gendered nouns, but in general. So individual factors like the size of one's vocabulary, cognitive control, literacy. Also external factors like external working memory load, the syntactic complexity, the presentation rate, the accent of the talker reliability, and what have you. So it's really complicated. And now we're talking about only one language, right? So if you add another language to the mix, it's even more complex, because all the above factors hold, of course, because also bilinguals are humans. But there is an increased variation because bilinguals differ a lot from each other in proficiency, in duration and type of exposure, the extent and context of the use of the different languages that they have. Of course, this variation is there in monolinguals as well, but it's exacerbated in bilinguals. Plus, you're dealing with more than one language, so you have these languages influencing each other. So an example is cognate effects. So that's the observation that words that are similar in form and meaning across languages are processed differently. But you also have influence of morphosyntactic mechanisms and processing strategies, and I'll give you an example later. Also, when you have more than one language, some communities tend to use both languages in the same context, in the same sentence. So you have code switching going on as well. So that makes sentence processing even more complex. Fun. So to illustrate to you what is going on with especially L2 speakers, so what, especially the factor of cross-linguistic influence, I'd like to again refer to that study on Norwegian that I just showed you. So in that same study, it was a study by Johannessen, they had several groups of second language Norwegian speakers or second language learners of Norwegian in that same study. And one group had Greek as their native language. Greek is a gendered language. Another group had Turkish as their native language, and Turkish does not use gender, at least not in determiners and such. The Greek speakers of Norwegian actually performed like Norwegian native speakers, so they could use the determiner information predictively. The L1 Turkish, which are actually matched in offline proficiency with the Greek speakers, show a different pattern. So they're not using the information predictively, but there is something going on with facilitation of the noun later in the auditory stream. So, you see that things are getting complex. It's cross-linguistic interference that non-trivially affects prediction. Also, proficiency, of course, affects predictive processing. So on the left here, you see what I showed you earlier, the Greek speakers of Norwegian. On the right is the same population, Greek speakers of Norwegian, but they're lower proficiency, and you see that they don't use gender information in Norwegian predictively at all. So this is just to illustrate how different factors can affect something seemingly simple as predictive processing. Code switching is another big thing in bilingual sentence processing. So again, code switching is the use of more than one language in the same conversation or the same sentence. Code switching as well is constrained and influenced by many, many, many factors. Individual factors, such as the proficiency in the languages, language dominance, social factors like social cues or the language combination. So even in the same community, you can sometimes switch between language A and language B, but not between language C and language B. So that's socially determined. There are pragmatic issues going on, but also structural issues or grammatical issues, as some people classify them. For instance, the switch, if you look at English, Spanish code switchers in Miami, I think it was here, they switch switching is okay between an auxiliary and a progressive participle, like you see in the first example, but switching between an auxiliary and a perfect participle is highly infrequent. So there's something structural maybe going on as well. So there are tons of factors that influence things. So that's what I discovered as an experimentalist. So how can computational models help, or how would I like computational models to help me, I must say. Since we're dealing with so many factors that influence predictive processing, code switching, whatever your favorite phenomenon is, I think there's a need of modeling these factors so we can clearly see how
the room seems to be muted.
Insight that you can get through modeling. Okay, so this is where models succeed. So we can test assumptions, we can reduce our theoretical machinery, we can test the effect of the exposure type. Other examples are from my fellow symposium members here. So Irene modeled the cognate effect. So that's the observation that words that overlap in form and frequency are processed differently. So she could show that you can model that just by the frequency differences between non-cognates and cognates without needing an extra mechanism for cognates. Another example is the effect of word frequency. So in L2 speakers, you see a larger effect of word frequency than in native speakers. And my fellow symposium members can also model that by looking at the amount of exposure. So in both the models and the humans, you get the same thing there. So those are the advantages and what I see as advantages, but there are, of course, many challenges left. And I'd like to discuss two. The first challenge is linking models to what you're actually measuring in an experiment. So how you get your data, what kind of task you use, what kind of measure, has a huge effect on what you see, especially related to the difference between native and non-native speakers. So for my own work, I found, for instance, that if you have a visual world paradigm in which people can see a restricted set of reference, that Chinese L2 speakers of English can use contrastive pitch accent to restrict that set of references. However, if you take the same sentences, same stimuli, same population, put them in an ERP experiment without having the visual context, they cannot, or at least not in the way native speakers do. So there's a difference between, you know, what you do in your experiment has a huge impact of what you get, especially related to the differences between native and non-native speakers or the effect of proficiency or whatever you're interested in. Also, if you look at, for instance, offline versus online measures, you see a lot of apparent discrepancies. So in my own work, I found that L2 speakers do show influence of the L1 in offline measures, but not during sentence processing. That's also a recent study find that as well, that online during processing, there was hardly any difference between the groups, but offline after the sentence, actually L2 speakers were better at avoiding agreement errors than native speakers. So there's some differences in what you find depending on your task. Oops. Very quickly, another big group of challenges is the cognitive and ecological plausibility. And in past symposia here in this conference, these things also came up. So the psychological plausibility of the learning mechanism. And there's now a whole debate about whether humans indeed use prediction and error-based learning to learn. It's definitely not the whole story. The length of exposure, so it's often being criticized that models need a huge exposure phase, training phase that doesn't correspond to what humans do. What I also would like to address is the different kind of exposure that humans have. So in the bilingualism literature, it's now being stressed that it's not only active use of a language that affects people's proficiency and ability to learn, also passive usage, just being in a diverse environment, language environment, and hearing other languages has an effect. So it'd be very interesting to try to model that as well. Also, of course, a scaling up issue is a huge challenge. So humans learn not on the basis of a nutshell little training set, but are exposed to an enormous variety of structures at the same time. And last but not least, language is situated in a physical environment and above all a social environment. For instance, and that affects language comprehension. So for instance, in one of my later recent studies, I look at the comprehension of code switches, and what you see in the brain signal is very much affected by whether the person sitting next to you is a fellow bilingual or is a monolingual. So there's some social effects that play a huge role as well. So to conclude, a lot of information, but to conclude, I don't need to convince this audience that sentence comprehension is really complicated, especially when you look at more than one language. Modeling can help experimentalists by testing theoretical assumptions, testing the effects of exposure type, simulating hypothetical language parameters, reducing theoretical machinery. But there are many challenges left, among which the linking between what you measure in the experiment and maybe the frequencies that you get out of a corpus. And of course, making models more cognitively and ecologically plausible. Okay, so I'd like to thank you, also the members of my lab and other people, and NSF for a grant that we currently have on code switching and cognitive control. Thank you so much.
Are there any urgent questions? On Zoom, maybe? If not, then let's move on to the second speaker. So the next speaker is Han Khoe. He's currently a PhD student at Radboud University in Nijmegen. But he already had a long non-academic career before that, starting as a web developer and a programmer. And so I learned just 2 days ago he was also for a while a poker player. But then he realized he was actually more interested in linguistics. And he's going to talk to us about modeling cross-language structural priming.
Thank you, Stefan. So yeah, I will talk today to you about the modeling work I've been doing on cross-language structural priming together with Gerard Zoekala, Gerrit-Jan Kootstra, Stefan and Rob Schone. Structural priming is the phenomenon that when someone encounters a syntactic structure, they are after that more likely to use that structure instead of an possible alternative structure. For example, with passives, this has been experimentally demonstrated by Bock in 1986 in a picture description task. But this doesn't only occur within one language, it also happens between different languages. For example, for transitives in Spanish and English, which has been shown in adults and in children. So why does this happen? There are two competing accounts. According to the first account, this is the result of residual activation of syntactic representations and combinatorial nodes. According to another account, the implicit learning account, it's the result of implicit learning. So when prediction error occurs, strengthening of connections for an encountered structure follows, which then leads to increased production of that structure, and that's what we then see in experiments as structural priming. So the implicit learning account has been implemented in the dual path sentence production model. This model learns to convert messages into sentences in a miniature language, and these messages contain connections between thematic roles, such as X and Y in the example here, and concepts such as cat or dog. And it also contains event semantic information. So as Edith already told you, it's based on the simple recurrent network, which is extended with a second path, the meaning path, which the model uses to learn word form to meaning mappings. And this model has been used to model monolingual structural priming in English and in German. And as Edith already also mentioned, it's been used to model code switching in Spanish and English, and also cross-linguistic transfer. Compared to the original dual path model, it added a target language in the meaning path, and of course it has two different languages in the input and the output. What wasn't investigated yet was whether structural priming would also occur between different languages in the bilingual version of the model. So that's what we tried to find out, and we were also interested in seeing whether the strength of that cross-language priming effect would differ from the within-language priming effect. Finally, we wanted to know whether structural priming between different languages requires identical word order for the structures involved. So in Dutch, there are different passives. There's verb medial and verb final passives. So in the case of verb final passives, the word order for passives would be different between Dutch and English. So we trained individual instances of the model, and each of those instances is trained on 8,000 unique message sentence pairs. Each experiment had 80 of those simulated participants, and in these experiments the balance between the two languages was approximately equal. The experiments had 800 trials, and it had a 2x2x2 design with the prime structure, language combination, and prime language. And the simulated experimental procedure is as follows. We first present the prime sentence, we present the model with a prime sentence without a message, but with learning turned on in the model. Then we use a target message to elicit a response from the model, and then we see whether it's what the structure of that response is. And after each trial, we reset the weights to the values before the trial, which is the same as the values at the start of the experiment. So we had 3 experiments, first Spanish and English, and then 2 experiments with different versions of Dutch, one with verb final passives and one with verb medial passives. Here I'm showing the descriptive results for the Spanish-English experiment. The dark black bars show that there's an increased production of passives after a passive prime compared to an active prime. And if you compare cross-language on the left and within language on the right, you'll see a steeper line going up for within language, which indicates a stronger effect compared to cross-language. And overall, this is what we see in all 3 experiments, including in the experiment where the word order was different for Dutch passives compared to English, which suggests that priming in the model does not require identical word order. We did a pre-registered Bayesian logistic mixed effects analysis with whether the target sentence is passive as a dependent variable, and the prime structure and interaction of prime structure with language combination as the predictors that we interpreted. Here we show the distribution of the estimate for the prime structure predictor, and the positive estimate in all cases suggests priming in the model, and we see that for experiment 2A, for the green line, that and the strength of that effect is weaker than for the other experiments where word order was identical for the structures involved. And the positive estimate for the interaction, where we see the estimate, the posterior distribution of that estimate here, shows that within language priming was indeed stronger than cross-language priming. So, as Edith also just mentioned, when you're studying bilinguals, there's variability involved caused by proficiency or exposure. That's also the case as proposed by Hartsuiker and colleagues. They think that an L2 learner will at first develop structural representations independently for an L2, independent from the L1 representations, and only when they become more proficient will these structural representations integrate, and only then would cross-language priming be possible. So this has been investigated experimentally, but the results are mixed. There's about equal numbers of studies that find an effect or not. But if we look at the bilinguals who were the participants in those experiments, we see that mostly they're sequential bilinguals, but only one study they were simultaneous bilinguals. And I thought that for those same simultaneous bilinguals, an effect might not be expected because they learn the languages at the same time. So I think if you learn the syntactic representations from the start for both languages, they can also integrate from the start, and then this would mean that cross-language priming would not be modulated by proficiency in these bilinguals. So that's how I propose to extend Hartsuiker's account. So then the question, of course, is whether in the model, if we have simultaneous bilinguals, I would expect not to see an effect of proficiency or exposure, which I operationalized as meaning accuracy or syntactic accuracy for proficiency, or as the percentage of input in the dominant language and the non-dominant language during training for exposure. So I performed another simulated experiment with simulated simultaneous participants with only cross-language trials and only prime sentences in a non-dominant language. And so the input in this case was unbalanced, and that resulted in variation in the meaning accuracy, the grammatical accuracy, and in the input, of course. And these predictors had a standard deviation that's comparable to the standard deviation of predictors in the experiments that I've shown before. So we performed an exploratory Bayesian analysis, this time looking at base factors, where we compare models that include an interaction with one of the predictors of interest with prime type, and the non-model did not contain that interaction. Otherwise, the analysis was the same as before. And of course, we performed a sensitivity analysis because the informativity of the prior with a high standard deviation biases towards null. And we also thought that maybe with a higher learning rate, which leads to stronger priming, there might be a more detectable interaction. So we also varied the learning rate in the experiments. So the results of the analysis led to only base factors that were all smaller than 1, which suggests evidence leading towards null. And the values of the base factors ranged from values that indicate anecdotal evidence to strong evidence. And as expected, there was more evidence for the null with a less informative prior, but we didn't see any effect of varying the learning rate in a systematic way. So based on that, our exploratory conclusion is that there's no evidence for an effect of proficiency on or exposure on the strength of the cross-language priming effect. And so next we're going to conduct a pre-registered version of this experiment with a different language pair. And then, more interestingly, we will look at sequential bilinguals and see whether in those simulations we do get a modulating effect of proficiency or exposure on the strength of the priming effect, which would then complete the proposed account by Hartsuiker. Are there any questions? And you can find the details in these two papers.
Are there any urgent clarification questions? Maybe on Zoom? If not,
Hello, can you hear me?
yes?
Yep.
So I'm the technical chair, and I asked a question myself. So
Okay.
is asymmetric priming between L2 and L1 in the modeling? So I know in some cross-language lexical priming experiments, usually L1 words prime L2 words, but it's not the other direction. So I wonder, have you conducted research to examine this?
Yes, so in the first set of experiments, the priming effect goes both ways. But there, the languages are balanced. So there is some variation in proficiency in the two languages, but it's not very large. And in the second experiment, we only looked at priming in one direction, because that's what in the experiments that I was simulating is what happens mostly.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
And now I would like to, please invite Lin Chen to present. So she's a research associate at the Learning Research and Development Center at the University of Pittsburgh. She's interested in word reading, reading comprehension, and language acquisition. She did her PhD in psychology in the South China Normal University, and then she was a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Chinese, Sun Yat-sen University, China, sorry for the mispronunciation, where she also was then later assistant professor and associate professor before joining the University of Pittsburgh.
Thank you very much.
Please.
Hi everyone, I'm Lin. Today I'm very excited to share my work about incremental reading comprehension. So what is incremental reading? When we read, readers continuously and incrementally update their mental representation of a text, word by word and phrase by phrase. Successful reading comprehension relies on a series of processes, such as identify the word, retrieve the meaning of the word, building the structure of the sentence, or integrate the word meaning into the text, and also make inferences. Compared to reading a native language, reading a second language requires actual effort. Even after many years of reading a second language, like me, native-like effortless reading, still very challenging. So my research question we are interested is what are the differences of reading a first language and the second language? Is second language incremental reading mediated by the same linguistic variables as in first language reading? There are some special features of our approach. Research has studied incremental processes in restricted experimental settings focused on specific target words. We improved this by using authentic reading materials from the New York Times and examine how these processes unfold across our words in a passage. We use both ERP and self-paced reading to test reading English as a first language and a second language. We have 3 groups of second language readers: Spanish English bilingual, Korean English bilingual, and Chinese English bilingual. Include these 3 groups of second language readers, we can test whether the first language background will affect second language reading. Spanish and English are from the same Indo-European language family and also use the same alphabetic writing system. Korean also use the alphabetic writing system, even they use different letters, but they are from a different language family. Chinese and English are from different language families and use different writing systems. So today I will focus on the results of self-paced reading, focus on reading English as a first language and also 2 groups of second language readers, Spanish English bilinguals and Chinese English bilinguals, because we are still collecting data for the Korean English bilinguals. So the linguistic factors we are interested in include both lexical level and syntactic level factors. On lexical level, besides the corpora-based word frequency, we also included a word familiarity to capture the actual word exposure for readers, especially for second language learners. On the syntactic level, we include syntactic complexity. So we use the number of a word close of phrase structures to indicate syntactic complexity. For example, in this sentence, hands close 3 phrase structures, so the number is 3. When a word close more phrase structures, the more syntactically complex it is. So besides lexical level and syntactic level factors, we also include word precision, which include both lexical level and syntactic level information. By include word precision, we can examine the structure building of semantic and syntactic information. We also include word probability, which is surprisal based on probabilistic language models to test whether surprisal can predict L1 and L2 reading. So surprisal is the negative log probability of a word based on the preceding words. We included 2 types of surprisal. One is word surprisal. So word surprisal is the surprisal of a word based on the preceding actual words. We also have syntactic surprisal. It's the probability of a word based on the part of speech of preceding words. So compared to word surprisal, syntactic surprisal only have syntactic information without lexical and semantic information. Also, surprisal can be estimated by different kinds of language models. In our study, we include 2 kinds of models. One is N-gram, one is PCFG. Compared to N-gram model, PCFG include hierarchical syntactic structural information when estimate word surprisal. By including 2 types of words, 2 types of surprisal, word surprisal and syntactic surprisal, estimated by Ngram and PCFG models, we can answer the following two questions. The first one is, does including lexical information in the estimation of surprisal improve performance in predicting L1 and L2 rating? If this is true, we expect word surprisal that include lexical information can explain variance more and above syntactic surprisal. The second question is, does including hierarchical syntactic structure information in estimation of surprisal improve performance in predicting L1 and L2 rating? If this is true, we expect the surprisal based on PCFG can explain more variance in reading times more and above surprisal estimated by Ngram models. So we used self-paced rating. Here is an illustration of what is self-paced rating. So in the self-paced rating, each word was indicated by a series of underscores. When participants pressed the spacebar, the first series of underscores converted into the first word of the sentence. When participants pressed the spacebar again, the first word was reverted to the underscores. Okay, for data analysis, we use a linear mixed regression models. We include 3 groups of the participants in one model and include language background, first language or Chinese English or Spanish English as a fixed effect. By test, the interaction between language background and the predictors, we are interested to examine the differences between L1 and L2 rating. So here are the results. First, let's look at whether lexical level factors affect L1 and L2 rating. We found word frequency and word familiarity both affect reading times in L1 and L2 rating. So from this figure, you can tell the x-axis is word frequency, y-axis is reading time. You might wonder why the word frequency is negative, because we standardize all the predictors in the model. So that's why. So the blue line indicates Chinese English bilingual. The green line indicates Spanish English bilingual, and the orange line indicates the English native speakers. So from these 2 figures, we can tell high word frequency and high word familiarity are associated with short reading times. And word frequency is more influential in L2 reading, especially for Chinese English bilinguals. But these 3 groups of readers showed a similar pattern for word familiarity. So this suggests subjective word familiarity can better capture readers' actual word exposure, especially for second language learners. Also, we found syntactic level factors, syntactic complexity affect both L1 and L2 reading. When a word is syntactically complex, the reading time increases. And these 3 groups showed a similar pattern. In second language learning, there is one view about second language learners have different syntactic representations from native speakers. So by comparing the sensitivity for these three groups to syntactic complexity, our results suggest both native speakers and second language learners, they are similarly sensitive to the syntactic processes. Also, we found a word precision effect. Generally, word reading times decreases as readers progress through the sentence. And this effect is more pronounced in L2 reading. Reading words near the beginning of the sentence showed longer reading times, suggest a higher startup cost for L2 learners to build semantic and syntactic representation of the sentence. We also observed Spanish English speakers showed a pattern more similar to native speakers than Chinese English bilinguals. So this might be related to English and Spanish share more similarities than English and Chinese. We also interested in whether surprisal can predict reading times. So here's the result based on PCFG model. So we found word surprisal and syntactic surprisal both predict L1 and L2 reading times. Readers take a longer time to read the words with great surprisal. The similar results were found by N-gram model. So we are interested in the surprisal, two types of surprisal estimated by two language models show differences. So we found the word surprisal estimated by N-gram can explain variance in reading times above syntactic surprisal. But this only be found for native speakers, not second language readers. So to sum up, first, we found both L1 and L2 reading were sensitive to lexical and syntactic level factors like word frequency, word familiarity, syntactic complexity, syntactic surprisal. This suggests L1 and L2 incremental reading processes generally rely on lexical retrieval and syntactic structure building. Also, we found some differences. First, L2 readers showed a higher startup cost to build semantic and syntactic representations of the sentence indicated by word precision effect. Also, L2 learners are less sensitive to the variations of the predictive opportunity measured by language models. The last thing I want to say is because our participants are relatively high proficient English speakers, so whether second language learners will show the similar pattern worth further exploration. I would like to thank my collaborators and research assistants at our lab, and I'm open to take questions.
Sorry, just a clarification. So you computed both. Should I go there? Hi, sorry, just a clarification question. So did you compute both syntactic and semantic surprisal on each model? So how did you do it with n-grams? So how did you compute syntactic surprisal on the n-grams?
Syntactic surprisal is based on the part of speech of preceding words.
Yeah, right, but so for the n-grams, did you actually train the n-gram models on the language, on the tags, on the part of speech tags?
Yes.
Oh, okay, that makes sense.
Thank you.
Did you take into account spillover effects in self-paced reading, which can also differ between L1 and L2?
Sorry, what
The
did
spillover effects that you find in self-paced reading, did you also take these into account in the analysis?
That's a good question. We haven't analyzed the data to test the spillover effect, but that's a good suggestion. Thank you.
And now the last talk is both from Irene Winther and Yevgen Matusevych. Okay. Okay. Sorry.
Sorry, we can switch
So I need
slides.
to. Okay. So I will. So Irene Winther is now a PhD student with Martin Pickering and Yevgen Matusevych. She's studying bilingualism using behavioral and computational model for both comprehension and production of language. And she did a Master of Science in Psychology also at the University of Edinburgh on the effect of semantic constraint and lexical access in bilingual word recognition. And concerning Yevgen, he's a research associate, so also at the University of Edinburgh. And he's interested in cognitive constraints that shape natural languages and the understanding of phonetic learning and speech perception in native and non-native speakers. And he was a PhD student at the Tilburg University in Netherlands, and then a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Toronto on bilingual color cognition and free word association. So, please.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Irene, and thanks everyone for joining this talk today. I'm here today to tell you about a project that we've been working on with my supervisor Yevgen, where we've been looking at effects of word frequency in computational language models that have been trained on 2 languages. So word frequency, as Edith and Lin has already been talking about, is one of the most important variables that determine the speed that it takes to recognize a word. Can you actually hear me? So what we call the word frequency effect is the finding that words that occur often in a language, they're processed faster than words that do not occur that often. And these findings, they hold across different tasks and experimental paradigms as well. But when it comes to bilinguals, the issue is not that straightforward. And this is because bilinguals, they kind of divide their use or the time in which they use both languages, so that the number of times that they see words, especially in their second language, in the case of unbalanced bilinguals, will be lower than for monolingual speakers of those languages. And there have been a few studies that have looked at word frequency effects in bilinguals, and these studies have actually found that the size of the effect is larger in second language processing than in first language processing, and this is driven by low frequency words, so these are especially slowed down for bilinguals, so that this increases the difference in processing speed between high and low frequency words in a second language. However, if you look at native language reading, then you find similarly sized word frequency effects between the 2 groups. So there have been some explanations that kind of look at why we observe these differences in the effect. One hypothesis is based on this assumption of language competition. So here the idea is that the first language representations, they compete for activation when you process in a second language. And the explanation here is that the competition from these representations of first language words, they inhibit the recognition for second language words, and this competition especially affects words in the lower frequency range. And this is then what leads to this increased difference between in the processing speed between low and high frequency second language words. Then there's this second, more usage or exposure-based hypothesis, and here the explanation is that because of this disproportionate exposure between the languages, you get weaker representations for words in the second language in lexical memory. So again, low frequency words will be especially affected by this, and this increases kind of the difference between processing low and high frequency second language words. So with our work, we're looking at this second hypothesis because, or if you have a computational model that we use that's trained on 2 languages, there's no qualitative differences between a model that's learned from 1 versus 2 languages. So our starting point for our experiments is this eye tracking analysis from Yevgen Matusevych and colleagues, where they analyzed this huge eye tracking corpus that consisted of data from Dutch-English bilinguals and English monolinguals that read they read a whole novel in English or also in Dutch in the case of the bilinguals. And they analyzed this with relation to the word frequency effect. And of course, they find that there's a larger effect in second language than in first language reading, and that the effect is similar in bilingual and monolingual native language reading. So we wanted to see if we can replicate these findings in neural language models. And the reason why we wanted to do this is firstly because word frequency is such an important variable for language processing. Seeing how they handle word frequency could tell us more about kind of how good they are at modeling bilingual language processing. And this is of course useful to kind of better understand the dynamics of learning between humans and these computational language models. And secondly as well, if these patterns correspond, then we can kind of use these models perhaps as a basis to explore these usage-based accounts of the frequency accounts. As I said, because there are no qualitative differences between monolingual and bilingual models. So what we did is we took an LSTM model that we've previously used to replicate a pretty well-known bilingual phenomenon that's called the cognate facilitation effect. So we kind of knew it kind of behaves like human bilinguals. And in addition to training monolingual models, we also trained a model on Dutch as a first language and English as a second language. And the language exposure for the bilingual model was unbalanced, so it saw more first language than second language data. And to see if our models behave similarly to the human bilinguals, we tested them then on the whole stimuli from this eye tracking corpus. So that was the novel. And then we used surprisal, word level surprisal as the quantitative measure of the processing effort in the models. So lower surprisal means kind of easier processing. So in addition to a general word frequency effect, we also expect that the size of the frequency effect should be larger when the models are tested in the second language than when they're tested on the first language, but the same when they're tested in the first language. So I can now move on to our results. So just to mention, we found in general in all the models a general effect of word frequency. So higher frequency words had lower surprisal than low frequency words. Here we're looking at first language processing in the models. On the x-axis we have the centered word frequency. On the y-axis we have square root transformed surprisal. And these are the monolingual English model and the bilingual model tested on their respective first languages. And here, as expected, we found no interaction between word frequency and group. The size of the frequency effect was the same. I don't know if it's that easy to see from this plot, but we ran this with a mixed effects model, and the interaction was not significant. So this is kind of what we expected from the human data. We also did a different type of comparison in first language reading. Here the bilingual model was compared to the Dutch monolingual model, again tested on the first language. Here our results were somewhat inconclusive. So if you look at this plot, you can clearly see there's no interaction because the lines are nearly identical. But when we fitted a mixed effects model to this data, then the slopes were somewhat different, and we did find a significant difference in the size of the frequency effect between the monolingual and the bilingual model. And we can move on to first language versus second language reading. Here the bilingual model was tested on its first language Dutch or its second language English. As you can see, the slope for the second language, the darker color, is a bit steeper than it is for the first language. And we also, with the regression, found an interaction between word frequency and the test language, such that it's larger in the second language than in the first language. Again, it is what we expect from the human data. And lastly, we compared the monolingual English model to the bilingual when it was tested on its second language English. Again, the regression model, in the regression model, the interaction was significant, and the effect was larger again in second language processing. So quickly, just to reiterate our results, in the first language processing, our results partly matched that of the human data. However, not in the case of the Dutch versus Dutch comparison. We don't know why this is, but we also don't have human data from Dutch monolinguals to, explore this further. In second versus first language processing, our result did match the patterns from the eye tracking analysis, which kind of suggests that these type of models, they may handle word frequency in kind of a similar manner as humans, and that means we could use these models to further explore these kind of usage-based explanations of word frequency effects. So that's everything from me. I'm going to pass over to Yevgen, who's going to talk a bit further about word frequency effects in the models and a bit of the challenges we face when we do this kind of work. Thank you.
Thank you, Irene. I won't take too much time. As Irene said, the frequency effects are central to many theories of cognitive linguistics and language acquisition and production. And one of the motivations for this study was a mismatch between how much we know about frequency effects in human speakers and how little we know about those in the computational models. As Irene has shown you, there are some interesting results, but basically, about a year ago, we did a quick literature review, and the only plot that we could find about this was what you see in the slide right now. So this was a very basic finding that the word surprisal is inversely correlated with its word frequency. So this is great. At least we know that basic assumptions hold. But we wanted to go one step further and actually see if we can learn something about the bilingual models. So you have seen some results now, which you might find not very straightforward. And this is partly because this work is actually quite challenging, so I think it's important to acknowledge those challenges. So instead of showing you more data, I would just like to spell out some of the challenges that we ran into in this project and also in the similar projects. So yesterday at the poster session, a couple of people came up to me and asked, so what makes a model a balanced or an unbalanced speaker? And how do you define a bilingual at all? And this is the kind of questions that Irene worked a lot last year when preparing the cognitive facilitation effect paper. And she tested a lot of different conditions of input presentation. But what we realized is that there is not even an established way to actually map different conditions of input presentations to different kind of speakers, like balanced or unbalanced speakers, simultaneous or sequential bilingual speakers. So I think as a community we really need to understand how do we map models to human speakers. Do we look at proficiency? Do we look at the order of presentation or at the amount of language input to the model? That's one of the questions. But even if we manage to resolve that issue, we might want to compare different types of models or different types of computational learners to each other, or even to monolingual models. And that's also not very straightforward sometimes, because these models are often trained on different vocabularies. And mathematically, it just doesn't make sense to compare perplexities of different models trained on different vocabularies. What we did in this study was simply to take the standard scores using the Z transformation. And that's maybe one way to do it, but perhaps there are better ways, and that's something that, again, we can discuss. Now, if you talk to any kind of SLA researchers or researchers in the field of bilingualism, of course they will tell you that one of the most pervasive phenomena is the cross-linguistic transfer or interference. And surprisingly, we don't know much about that kind of transfer in the models. There are a couple of studies from the University of Groningen, but I don't think we still know a lot about that. And of particular interest is the semantic transfer, because that's probably a topic for another talk, which I'm not going to go into that, but again, we can talk about it in the discussion. Another dimension on which these models are probably different from humans is the speed of forgetting. So in another project, I had to train English model on a small amount of pseudo-English with a different word order. And I could see that the model actually starts forgetting English after just a few epochs of exposure to that pseudo-language. So I think that's very different from humans who actually keep their knowledge of L1 regardless of the amount of L2 exposure, right? So we need to be aware of that, at least to some extent. And finally, of course, the languages across the globe are insanely diverse. So here we've just been using English and Dutch, and these are pretty common in modern literature. But I think it's important to keep in mind that there are lots of languages, and how do we model a bilingual who is speaking, for example, Hungarian and Chinese, which are very rich, very different in the level of their morphological complexity, right? So all these challenges might sound a bit intimidating to non-modelers, but I think we should see here an opportunity rather than a problem. So as you have heard from Emily's keynote talk yesterday, the computer science is extremely overfunded, so there are advances coming up literally every year, or maybe even every month, and not all of them are cognitively plausible. So I actually think we need to talk to computer scientists and also to psycholinguists and cognitive scientists to keep these discussions ongoing and to figure out what works for us as modelers. Yep. And of course, thank you to the organizers of this symposium for actually providing this space for the dialogue. Thank you very much. And I guess if there are questions for Irene before we move to the discussion, please ask them.
I have a quick question. When you say word frequency effect in the model, then, so the model doesn't actually read, right? It doesn't have a reading time. So then you mean an effect of surprisal on frequency? Or what
yes.
does it mean
So, as we interpret the word frequency effect in a model, that words that have higher frequency would have lower surprisal than words of low frequency.
Just on your last point about the challenges, it's a small thing, but I thought it was quite interesting. You said about the forgetting problem. Isn't there a phenomenon of L1 attrition? So where you can actually, if you've had enough second language exposure for enough time, you would start to forget the L1.
Yeah, certainly. Probably my wording was a bit too strong. Of course, it's possible to forget L1 in principle, but what I was meant to say is that the scale of that issue is really not comparable in the models versus humans. You know, if I learn a second language for a year without L1 exposure, I probably won't forget L1.
Whereas we see something that would be able to be modeled.
Attrition. Yeah, it's actually very easy to model because the model forgets the L1 very easily. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so there's no question in the chat, but I do have a question about the details of the training. So what's the order of presentation of English Dutch in the model? And what is the training performance of the monolingual and bilingual? For example, the perplexity or something similar to that? Are they, for example, if you restrict to just the English or the Dutch, the L1, are they similar, comparable? Yeah.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Thank you. So the order of presentation for these bilingual models, where we presented the first and second language data separately, so it's first language and then the second language. We've done other experiments where we kind of shuffled sentences, but these models didn't display the cognate facilitation effect, so we're kind of assuming that these bilinguals would probably exhibit that cognate facilitation effect, so that's why we chose this model. And also in our previous paper, we tested these models with regard to perplexity. So first language perplexity was pretty low for all the models. However, there was quite a lot more variation in second language perplexity. And we also found that perplexity kind of had an effect on whether or not the models displayed this cognate facilitation effect. So we were kind of saying, you know, it's not a great way, or I'm not sure if it's a good way to measure proficiency, but it seemed to have the similar patterns as humans with regard to cognate facilitation, that higher perplexity was kind of lower proficiency. In those models, we saw the cognate facilitation effect, and you also see cognate facilitation in lower proficiency bilinguals, or at least stronger effects of it. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, for the participants, it gave you a little bit of insight in this kind of emerging field of bilingual processing. And so maybe we can go a few slides before. We have a nice slide with a lot of challenges here. So, but of course, yeah, you can ask questions in the audience. So, or maybe does one of the speakers wants to answer some challenges of Yevgen?
I have a question again if nobody else does. For Edith in particular, so you mentioned models can, what was the term you used? Something about reduced theoretical machinery. So what exactly did you mean by that?
Hi, sorry not to be clear in my talk, but for instance, from the work from Irene, like some psycholinguists account for the cognitive effect, for instance, by introducing something that's qualitatively different between the L1 and L2, for instance. So that's something extra. Whereas if you can show it's just due to frequency effects, you don't need that extra stuff. So that's what I mean by reducing machinery. Or having a special mechanism for code switching, where you can also show it just falls out of exposure. That's the kind of examples I was thinking of.
But couldn't a model also increase the machinery by showing that you do need something? That
Yep, of course, yes, yes.
Necessary?
Yeah, it's all, you know, what you think of Occam's razor, whether you value that or not, yeah.
Some questions online? Oh.
I would have a question myself, or an issue for discussion. So what I see very often in you know, few papers I've read about modeling L2 is that most of the studies use as a database for establishing frequencies or surprisal. They use databases that are for native speakers. And I wonder to what extent that's justified. So I know Lin has another method by looking at familiarity. But I was wondering whether that's actually the right approach. So can you assume that a big database that you have for native speakers just translate it over to second language? I just want to hear people's opinion about that, or whether we should have a GPT-3 for like L2 speakers, for instance.
GPT-2 and 3, they're very large language models that are trained on billions and billions and billions of data, yes, if that makes sense. So to your question, one thing that we kind of found very useful when we were doing this kind of modeling work is that we can actually use, count the exact frequencies that are in the input data for the models, so we know exactly how much they have seen. And of course, with bilingual speakers, this is probably almost an impossible task. So that's actually kind of what we found one of the benefits of these models. So, but we're yet to figure out how we could use that to kind of explore the relationship between these subjective and objective frequencies.
So would one solution be to try to restrict your corpus, not just by taking, say, 25% or whatever, but to maybe restrict it to particular registers as well? So for instance, textbook registers or academic registers. So I'm thinking, if you learn a language in an academic context, you probably don't know what, to have an example from my own experience, I did not know what a pansy was, even though every English kid knows that, the flower, that is. But I did know like these very complex academic words. So I was wondering, could we get to the problem I just sketched by carefully selecting what subcorpora we take? Or would just taking a fraction of an existing corpus be enough? Is it a matter of quantity, or is it a matter of quality and register as well?
Actually, in my study, we trained 3 data sets. We use Wikipedia because we think L2 learners, they are familiar with Wikipedia. And also we trained, let me think, it's Journal of Wall Street, because it's similar to our reading materials. Our reading materials are from New York Times, but because the Pantry Bank, which is the Wall Street Journal, is small size, so we also trained a similar size of Wikipedia. Interestingly, we found that the surprisal trend on these 3 data sets are very similar to each other. So I'm wondering whether, there's something there.
Well, I'm not sure I can answer to your comment because, I guess one thing that we might want to say is usually these effects are kind of balanced out on very large corpora, right? But I do agree that it can be problematic to look at the effects in this model at the level of individual words. So if you would be looking for, surprisal value for a particular word, you may not want to make big conclusions from that. But I think we tend to treat these models as like input-output machines. So if we know something about the input and we can map that property of the input to the property of the output, then I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And I think that's how these models should be used.
Hi, that was a very nice presentation. It kept me awake, or I tried, for the end of the conference. Just following up on Edith's point about register, and what we know about bilingualism, especially regarding whether you're balanced or unbalanced, is that you don't use the languages in the same context, right? So you might use Hindi at home and English at work. So how does that fit into any of your modeling, language use? Is that the social context? Is that anywhere near? Are we there yet? Are we going to get there?
It goes way too far to say that I could model that in my modeling, but I could take some of it into consideration, right? Also related to what was just said is, for example, if you look at the uses of syntactic structures,
right,
that's different if you encounter a lot of written language compared to only spoken language.
Right.
So if you have control over the language that you generate and use as input in your model, then you can take, for example, frequencies of passives in a spoken language corpus and compare that to a frequency of that structure in a written corpus, and then take that into account.
Right.
If you want to model different kinds of bilinguals who use their language in different contexts, right?
Yeah.
Does that
Yeah,
somewhat
cool.
answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, I had to put it out there because we know that bilinguals, it's rarely the case that in the same context you use both, right? Typically, right? So I just wanted to ask.
Yeah, and you're right. In several structural priming experiments where they don't find an effect, or it's different from what they expect, then an explanation that's often mentioned is that not every one of those bilinguals uses their language in the
100%.
same context. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Hello. So I have a question for comments for the second question. So I wonder whether we can use some kind of character-based language modeling. So because, for example, Dutch and English, they share the same character, and in the cross-language lexical research, we have that kind of effect from cognates, like words in different languages have the similar spelling, and false friends. They look the same but mean different things. I wonder if we use that kind of modeling, so we can do something. And also, so I was outside listening to the talk. I'm the technical chair, so I just came in.
Yeah, in principle we can do that. I guess the problem with using those models is that we understand them even worse than word-level language models. So while we know that they work well in various NLP applications or in machine translation, and in principle we actually try to use sub-word modeling at least for example, Mandarin. But I think it's very tricky because we don't actually know whether they do something cognitively plausible. So we can try using that, but there is no guarantee that they are like humans. I think that's my short response to that.
Hi, sorry if this came up. I've been in and out because I'm also volunteering. But this is kind of related to the order of presentation and a little bit about using a different corpus. So I was thinking about word frequency effects and how that can come from a completely adult corpus. But a lot of that effects that you see in adults might come from the fact that as a child you heard more frequent words. And it just reflects. You can see the adult corpus and see that. And when you're looking at bilingualism, that you get in kind of a rare time when you don't get any of the child language and you're just getting the adult corpus. So I was wondering what you thought about like how children's corpus and modeling kind of related to bilingualism and how it could be more helpful.
I guess I'll go. I have actually been thinking about this a lot because obviously frequency effects and age of acquisition effects are highly correlated, and I don't even know if we have any like data for bilinguals when it comes to age of acquisition kind of norms or anything like that, like we have for monolinguals. So yes, it's an issue that I've been thinking about, but also in these models, it's really weird because they kind of they see the same data like a number of times. That's how they learn. So that is also completely different from how humans learn. So I will leave that as an open question, but it was a great question. Thank you. Don't know if anyone wants to add to it.
I can imagine this question should maybe first be tested on smaller models. Like, for example, the bilingual dual path model that you guys are working with may be more suitable for that because you have much higher control over its input and you don't need a huge corpus of Wikipedia for like children or adults because there is no child Wikipedia.
Yeah, that's right. I guess in the same way that you can model language in different contexts, you can use. Yeah, basically that's the same thing, right? You can, if you know the properties of the language, of child-directed speech, for example, and the difference between that and adult language, then you can and you are in control of your input. You self-generate your input. Then you can take that into account. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, just following up on this, in some recent work with Gabriela Vigliocco at UCL, we compared models trained on child-directed speech. That was BBC, the children's programs from BBC, compared to the British National Corpus, so that's text for adults, and compared children speaking and with parents speaking to children and adults speaking to each other. And it did actually work, that you would find that the model trained on child language was more appropriate for the child-directed speech. Of course, this is still monolingual, but I can imagine that something similar might work in the bilingual case. And Jung, I thought, so the first question, simulating unbalanced speakers, you actually did that, right? So maybe you have some ideas, some other ideas about how that could also work for large language models, for example.
How did it work for large language models? I'm not sure. And also I'm not sure yet if the way I'm modeling unbalanced speakers is actually works right, because I haven't tested it for the sequential bilinguals. And if I see an effective proficiency on structural priming there, then that's an indication that it really works. But before I've done that, that's kind of an open question. Yeah. But I think Tsukala did also some modeling of unbalanced bilinguals. Yeah, she did model sequential unbalanced bilinguals, and I think her results were kind of what you would expect for code switching, right? Yeah.
Of course, you also need to look at the human cases. So what is an unbalanced bilingual if you look at human bilinguals? So most heritage speakers will be unbalanced, and you get these nice register differences too, because they grew up speaking one language and then they switch to another language. So it's a, well, you can model that as a sequential bilingual, but not like the Dutch L1, English L2. I mean, it's a different kind of unbalanced bilingual. So I think you really need to be clear about like what, even if you're doing experiments with humans, like how you define unbalanced and what measures do you use, because people can be equally proficient in both of their language, but they just use one language more than the other. That's also an unbalanced bilingual.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. But as you said, that's the multidimensionality of multilingualism is something that we probably first need to solve in our experiments with humans before we start to simulate those experiments with models, right?
Really clear what
Yeah, yeah.
More questions online? Yeah?
So I guess the work we presented today is kind of a middle ground between very small models in cognitive science, which use just a very limited amount of input, and these gigantic models which are pre-trained on a lot of data. So one question that we sometimes get is, for example, why you're using these LSTM models and not something more state-of-the-art. So I guess I would like to ask how people feel about using these kind of models like GPT-3, if there is any potential for bilingualism, or have you ever thought of that, or do you have any ideas about how that could work? And I understand I probably should be the person actually answering this question, but at the same time I would like to hear others' opinions.
Yeah, I think one of the problem is if you train a transformer like a GPT-2, you cannot train it yourself. And the other benefit of LSTM, which I tried in the past, is it is a sequential model, so you can try the surprisal, that kind of effect. Yeah, if you use a BERT, that kind of bidirectional model, you lose track of that kind of like prediction.
Most of our discussion so far seemed to be aimed on how do we model the different vocabularies and different types of language input from bilinguals. So that does require you need to train your own model, right? You need to make sure that the input sort of matches the human input, and if you take a pre-trained model, that's totally out of the question. I mean, not just for the technical difficulty, the amount of compute you need, but also it's just with so much data, you already know it's going to be totally unrealistic, even in one language. I think so. Actually, doing bilingualism seems to me like a very good excuse not to use these off-the-shelf models, but to keep it in your own hands.
Yeah, not much to say about, yeah, I agree, but even not using LSTM, but other incremental model like reservoirs, so recurrent neural networks that are untrained for the recurrent part, so you don't even have to use the backpropagation through time. But so yeah, just to say, I agree to, yeah, that's probably richer to have this incremental learning, and yeah, maybe to add something, like you could use like just a word representation from transformers or this kind of models, so you can use still both at the same time, I would say. Both of the, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, one suggestion I would make is that if you want to think about training a transformer, there are a lot of new variants of transformers constantly coming out, and a lot of them are designed at reducing the computational burden. So things like the perceiver, Electra, and certain classes of those models might be useful in a bilingual context because you can not do training directly on bytes as opposed to subword tokenization, for example, in an architecture like the perceiver. And you can, with things like Electra, you can train them on, like in a small one in a day on a V100. So it's like achievable in practice, but you do still need some compute, but just not like a Google level.
That's great to know, thanks. We actually, so yesterday at a poster session, we presented some work with like some transformers that we trained ourselves. So it's possible in principle, but it can be challenging if you want to use bigger architectures, yes.
Okay, I have a rather stupid question. So, okay, this is fine. We have like LSTM models, large language models, and they are performing quite good in some cases for some of the phenomena. And let's say they might be performing better than, let's say, the residual activation kind of model. But what do we learn from this? Like, if, let's say, LSTM model wins over let's say, the residual activation model or structural priming, what do we learn about like what's happening there in bilingual processing? I mean, that's not entirely clear to me. Maybe that was like an implicit point, but I have no idea, like, what do we learn if these models are performing really well? So what's the point?
Well, I guess my first question back is, what does it mean that they actually perform better? Because usually we are not looking for the absolute performance, but we are looking at just correctly predicting some patterns found in human data, right? So if in principle we take a very simple model and that model can correctly predict the human data, then we should probably just stop at that model and not use more complex architectures, because as you said, there is no benefit to that. But if simpler models cannot predict the data, then maybe it means that we need something more complex, and then we need to move on and use larger models and different architectures.
Yeah, that point is, I think, quite clear, but let's say a complex model does better than a simple model. What does that tell us about bilingual processing in general?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of these studies are framed as a sort of learnability studies. So, for example, we ask questions such as, can a model, which is a sort of a statistical learner, learn something from the data alone? And is this sort of data enough to correctly predict the target phenomenon, right? Because it might be the case that actually just this sort of statistical learning and recurrent neural networks is simply not the right mechanism that that we could use. So if we show that such model can learn something from their data, it means we can say that that mechanism alone can account for the target pattern.
I see.
Well, can if the model can learn, and may not be enough if the model cannot learn the data.
Well, I think in order to draw that inference, we need to compare them against the models which do not have simple recurrent network assumptions, right? So, like, we can't make that inference in isolation with just these models. I mean, if we even have complex versions of the same like underlying theories, it doesn't mean that, well, this is the, like, let's say, the only underlying process that might work in bilingual learning and processing.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. It's better to do targeted hypothesis testing, but unfortunately we don't always have ready-made architectures for all the theories. So yeah, we are happy to design them when we can, but sometimes we have to limit ourselves to whatever is available in computer science. Yeah, I think that's my take on that.
Yeah, I think that remains a philosophical issue. So for instance, take that code switching model that I cited in my talk. This model performs kind of like humans, but it doesn't mean that what this model does is what humans do. We just don't know. Humans might have something completely different in their brains that makes them code switch between an auxiliary and a progressive participle. You just don't know. It's really challenging to come to this explanatory value. So all we have is behavioral equivalence. I think that came up in the one of the groups earlier in this conference. So we have behavioral equivalence, but doesn't mean that under the hood things perform in the same way.
Yeah, I think I also have the similar experience. Like, I use surprisal to predict reading time, so we found it's highly correlated. But we have hesitation to say surprisal is prediction. It equals human prediction. So I think there is a gap between NLP models with human cognitive processes. We really need to work on that.
Thank you. So I think there's not only behavior that we can compare the models to. For example, the dual path model, not in a bilingual, in the bilingual version, but for in a monolingual, the monolingual dual path model has also been used to compared to N400 and P600 effects. So there's not just the behavior, but also neural measurements that we can
But the problem
compare to.
remains there, I think.
In the end, the problem remains, but
The P600, but are the processes that give rise to that, are they equivalent?
yeah, I mean, you won't get 100% evidence that that's the case, but I think you do get a little bit closer if you have not only behavioral data, but also neural data, right? Maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, is that really fair? I mean, in the old examples, airplanes fly, birds fly, and the mechanisms are completely different. So, you know,
Yeah, but then if we,
completely different. So,
yeah, then in your example, you're talking about behavior again, and then if you look at another measure, for example, how much strange gases do they output while they're flying, which you then I could in this see as a metaphor for having extra data about neural data, then you would see a difference, right? And if you then see that they produce the same gases while flying, then maybe, yeah, it's more likely that they're doing the same kind of flying, right?
I think there are two roles the neural network model can do. The first is answer some in-principle argument, for example, like whether a human being can learn from like stimulus, which is very poor poverty, stimulus of poverty argument, or whether because the neural network models are just trained on texts, so there's no grounded information, like how much linguistic information we can learn from that. So they can use to answer this kind of arguments. The second thing I think is it's difficult to find perfect enough participants for L2 language studies, particularly if you want to balance them well. And if you use models, you can have as many participants as you want, and you solve the power issue. And I think that's the second benefit.
Yeah, thanks. I completely agree. I just wanted to, you know, be a bit provocative. So yeah, and that's hopefully what I illustrated in my talk too. So models do have their advantages and can help like form theories about what matters and what doesn't matter. But you know, the issue was raised as to behavioral equivalency. What does it mean? And you're never completely sure, right, that you're on the right track. But that holds for any theory, right? You can always be wrong.
I have a small point if you have time. So, like, there's also a problem with the way we infer from behavioral equivalence, because if you take a model and let's say that model had some parameter x, right? And if you can produce behavioral equivalence using like some sort of fit with that parameter value, like if you like, let's say you take any kind of behavioral data and you can fit the model to the data by just adjusting the parameter value, then I don't think that's really doing any quantitative behavioral equivalence. That's just sort of qualitative behavioral equivalence, but that's not fulfilling basically the reason we are using models to make quantitative predictions, because your model is unconstrained in that way that, like, if you just vary parameter value, you can generate any kind of predictions you want. So I think we need to also constrain the models to basically generate like very sort of like constrained range of predictions in order to make more reasonable inferences.
I think we all agree on that.
Okay. So maybe it's time to finish. So thank you again to the speakers and to all your questions. So if you, we will have some drinks together. So if you want to join us with the speakers, and maybe during the walk or the drinks, I have a last question, but we're not answering now, so just walking. So should we, are we ready to use some kind of models based on speech, like Wave2Vec or this kind of models, or do we still have to use text models? Okay, let's have drinks.
Okay, there is still the closing ceremony, right?
Yeah.